The scrapyard smelled like burnt metal and old fuel, and Daniel Hale liked it that way. He crawled through the broken hull of a transport ship, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Outpost Calder was full of wrecks like this one. People sent him out to strip them for parts, and he sold what he found to keep his small workshop running. It was not a glamorous life, but it was his. The transport had crashed 2 days ago, out past the old mining fields. Nobody knew where it came from. The Coalition patrols had been busy elsewhere, so the wreck sat untouched until Daniel found it on his scanner. He climbed deeper into the ship, past bent pipes and shattered screens, looking for anything worth selling. That was when he heard the sound. It was a low groan, almost like a growl, but softer. Paint. Daniel froze and pointed his flashlight toward a sealed cargo room at the back of the ship. The door was dented, like something had tried to break out of it. He hesitated. Out here, on the edge of colonized space, curiosity could get a person killed. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in Daniel could not just walk away. He pried the door open with a crowbar, his hands shaking slightly. Inside, curled up in the wreckage, was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It was large, easily twice his height, with dark green scales that shimmered even in the dim light. Its wings were folded tight against its body, torn in places. Its eyes were closed, and its breathing was shallow. Daniel took a step back. He knew what this was, or at least he had heard stories. A scarrow. The galaxy called them dragons, though that word did not do justice to how dangerous they truly were. These creatures had been bred as weapons generations ago, used in a war that nearly destroyed several worlds. After the war ended, the surviving scarrow were hunted down and destroyed under a strict galactic treaty. Nobody kept them. Nobody helped them. You reported them, and the Coalition came to finish the job. Daniel should have called it in right then. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But the creature stirred, and one eye opened, looking directly at him. It was not the eye of a monster. It was the eye of something scared and hurt, much smaller than the fearsome story suggested. It was young, maybe a child by whatever standard its kind used. Easy, Daniel whispered, holding up his hands. I'm not going to hurt you. The creature let out another groan and tried to move, but a piece of broken metal was pinning down its wing. Daniel could see fresh blood staining the scales. Without thinking too hard about it, he set down his tools and began clearing the debris. The creature watched him closely, tense, ready to strike if needed, but it did not attack. It simply watched. It took him almost an hour to free the wing and clean the wound as best he could with his basic medkit. The creature never made a sound of protest, though Daniel could tell it was in pain. When he finished, he sat back and looked at what he had done. He had just spent an hour treating a scarrow, a species every government in the galaxy wanted destroyed on sight. You're in a lot of trouble, Daniel said quietly. And now, I guess, so am I. He should have left it there and reported the wreck. Instead, he found himself building a makeshift sled from spare parts. And over the next few hours, he dragged the injured creature out of the wreck and back toward his workshop, moving only under the cover of the outpost's long night cycle. It was slow, exhausting work, and more than once he thought about giving up. But every time he looked back at the creature's tired eyes, he kept going. By the time he reached his workshop, the creature was barely conscious. Daniel laid it down in the back room, behind stacks of scrap metal and old machine parts, a space nobody ever bothered to check. He rigged a heat lamp nearby, since the wound needed warmth to heal properly, and sat down beside it, unsure what he had just gotten himself into. I don't even know what to call you, he muttered, mostly to himself. The creature's eyes opened again, watching him with quiet curiosity. There was something intelligent in that gaze, something that felt less like an animal and more like a person trapped in an unfamiliar body. Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. Rel, he said. That's what I'll call you. Rel. The creature made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and closed its eyes again, drifting into a healing sleep. Daniel sat there for a long while, listening to the quiet hum of his workshop and the steady breathing of the creature beside him. Outside, the outpost carried on as normal, unaware that somewhere in a cluttered back room, a scavenger had just taken in the one thing every Coalition ship in the sector had been sent to destroy. Far above the outpost, a Coalition patrol ship reported its missing transport, unaware that the cargo it had been escorting to its execution was very much alive, and already beginning to trust the first-kind face it had ever known. 3 weeks passed, and Rel grew faster than Daniel thought possible. What had once been a wounded creature curled in the corner of his workshop was now nearly filling the back room, its wings healed and its scales glowing a deeper shade of green. Daniel had to widen the doorway just so Rel could move between rooms without knocking over shelves. Feeding the creature became a full-time job on top of his usual work, but he did not mind. In a strange way, the outpost felt less lonely with Rel around. Daniel had built a life out of being invisible. He kept to himself, avoided trouble, and never asked questions about other people's business. That made it easier to hide Rel, since nobody expected the quiet scrap trader to be sheltering a creature every government in the galaxy wanted dead. Still, secrets on a small outpost rarely stayed secret for long. One evening, Daniel returned from the market with a sack of supplies and found the back door of his workshop wide open. His stomach dropped. He rushed inside, expecting the worst, only to find 3 local scavengers backed into a corner, pale and frozen, while Rel stood between them and a 4th man holding a knife to Daniel's storage crate. It seemed the group had broken in looking for parts to steal, not realizing what they would find guarding the place. "Don't move," Daniel said sharply, stepping into the room. The man with the knife flinched, glancing between Daniel and Rel. "What is that thing?" he demanded, voice shaking. Rel had not attacked. It stood tall, wings slightly spread, clearly ready to defend Daniel, but it had not harmed a single one of the intruders. That surprised Daniel more than anything. A creature bred for war, capable of tearing through steel, and it had chosen restraint over violence. "It's mine," Daniel said, which was not really an answer, but it was the only one he had. "Leave now, and we forget this happened." The intruders did not need to be told twice. They scrambled out through the broken door, disappearing into the outpost's maze of corridors. Daniel let out a breath he did not realize he was holding and turned to look at Rel, who was watching him with what looked like concern. "You didn't hurt them," Daniel said quietly. "You could have. Why didn't you?" Rel tilted its head, then gently nudged Daniel with its snout, almost like reassurance. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it told Daniel everything he needed to know. Whatever Rel had been created for, whatever purpose the old war had intended for creatures like it, this one had chosen something different. It had chosen him. News of the break-in spread quickly, as news always did on a small outpost. By the next morning, Captain Una Bosch, the station's commander, was standing at Daniel's front door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I heard some scavengers ran out of your shop looking like they'd seen a ghost," she said. "Care to explain?" Daniel's mind raced. Una was fair, but she was also responsible for the safety of everyone on Calder. If she found out what he was hiding, she would have no choice but to report it. "Just some thieves," he said carefully. "I scared them off." Una studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had commanded this outpost long enough to know when someone was hiding something, but she also knew Daniel was not the type to cause trouble. Still, something about the encounter did not sit right with her, and she made a mental note to keep an eye on the quiet scrap trader. After she left, Daniel closed the door and sank into a chair, his heart pounding. He was not built for secrets like this. Every day that passed, the risk of discovery grew a little larger, yet every day, he found himself less willing to give Rel up. That night, as the outpost's artificial sky dimmed into its simulated evening, Daniel sat beside Rel, running a hand along its scales while it rested its head near him. He thought about the galactic treaty, the fear that had followed the Scarrow species for generations, and the quiet, gentle creature in front of him that did not match a single part of that story. "They'd destroy you the second they found out," Daniel murmured. "Just for existing. Just for what your kind used to be, not what you are now." Rel's eyes opened halfway, and it let out a low sound, almost like a question. Daniel shook his head and managed a small smile. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not handing you over. Not now. Not ever." Outside, unaware of the quiet promise being made in a cluttered workshop, Una Bosch stood on the station's observation deck, staring out at the stars, her instincts telling her that something on Outpost Calder was not as ordinary as it seemed. A coalition shuttle arrived at Outpost Calder on a cold morning, its dark hull marked with symbols that made even seasoned traders lower their voices. Word spread through the station within minutes. A counselor was coming, and counselors did not visit small outposts like Calder without a serious reason. Daniel heard the news from a neighbor while restocking his shop shelves, and his blood ran cold. He knew immediately why they were here. The missing Scarrow transport had never been explained, and now, weeks later, someone important was finally following up on it. He rushed home to find Rel resting near the heat lamp, now large enough that hiding it indefinitely felt impossible. Rel sensed his tension immediately and lifted its head, watching him with quiet alertness. "They're here," Daniel said, pacing the small room. "The Coalition. Looking for you, probably." Rel made a low sound, almost like a question, but Daniel did not have an answer. He had spent weeks avoiding this exact moment, telling himself he would figure something out eventually. Eventually had arrived far sooner than he expected. Counselor Oves addressed the outpost that afternoon in the main hall, a tall alien with sharp, angular features and an air of authority that silenced the room the moment he began speaking. Daniel stood near the back, doing his best to blend into the crowd, though his heart pounded painfully in his chest. Several weeks ago, Oves began, his voice carrying easily without need of amplification. A Coalition transport carrying a dangerous cargo went missing near this sector. That cargo was a juvenile Scarrow, being escorted for lawful termination under the Unity Accord. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Most people on Calder had only heard stories of the Scarrow, tales meant to frighten children and justify old wars. Few had ever seen one, and fewer still understood what the creatures had actually been. The Scarrow were engineered as living weapons during the Great Conflict, Oves continued. They tore through fleets, leveled cities, and ended the lives of billions before the war finally ended. When peace was declared, every surviving Scarrow was hunted down and destroyed, without exception, to ensure such devastation could never happen again. This is not cruelty. This is survival. Daniel felt sick listening to the certainty in Oves's voice. He glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else could see through the fear dressed up as reason, but most faces simply nodded along, accepting the story as fact. "If the missing Scarrow is anywhere on this outpost," Oves said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, "I urge whoever is responsible to come forward now. Harboring such a creature, regardless of intention, carries severe consequences under galactic law." The room fell silent. Daniel kept his eyes forward, forcing himself not to react, though every instinct screamed at him to run. After a tense pause, Oves dismissed the gathering, announcing that Coalition officers would begin a full inspection of the outpost within the week. Daniel left the hall as quickly as he could without drawing attention, his mind racing. A week. He had a week before officers began searching every building, every workshop, every hidden corner of Calder. Rel would not survive discovery, not with Oves's clear stance on the matter. That evening, a knock came at his door. Daniel opened it cautiously, relieved to find Dr. Ren Tallis standing outside instead of Coalition officers. Ren worked at the outpost's small research station, studying alien biology, and had always struck Daniel as thoughtful, someone who asked questions rather than accepting easy answers. "I saw your face during Oves's speech," Ren said quietly, glancing around before stepping inside. "You know something." Daniel hesitated, weighing the risk of trusting her against the risk of facing this alone. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, letting her see into the back room, where Rel lay watching them both with cautious eyes. Ren's breath caught. She had studied old records of the Scarrow species during her research, fascinated by creatures she assumed no longer existed. Seeing one alive, calm, and clearly bonded to Daniel shattered everything she thought she understood. "It's not what the stories say," Daniel said quickly. "It's gentle. It's protected me. It's never hurt anyone." Ren stepped closer, studying Rel with a scientist's careful curiosity rather than fear. "The old records only describe them as weapons," she murmured. "Nobody ever studied what they were like outside of war." "Can you help me?" Daniel asked. "Oves is going to search every building. If they find Rel, they'll kill it on sight." Ren was quiet for a long moment, watching Rel's calm, intelligent eyes. Finally, she nodded. "I don't know how yet, but I'm not letting them destroy something this important without understanding it first. Give me some time. We'll find another way. Outside, the Coalition shuttle sat silently at the docking bay, its presence a constant reminder that time was running out, while inside a quiet workshop, an unlikely alliance had just begun to form. The cargo bay on Outpost Calder rarely saw much excitement, but on the third day of the Coalition inspection, it became the center of everything Daniel had feared. He had tried, along with Ren, to keep Rel hidden through careful planning, moving the creature between empty storage sections whenever officers came near his workshop. For 2 days, the plan had worked. On the third day, it fell apart completely. It started with an accident. A fuel canister in the cargo bay, damaged and long overdue for replacement, ruptured suddenly while workers were unloading supplies nearby. Sparks from a nearby machine caught the leaking fuel, and within seconds, flames spread across the storage racks. Workers scattered, shouting warnings, as the fire crept toward a stack of pressurized containers that would cause a much larger explosion if ignited. Daniel had been in the cargo bay collecting parts when the fire broke out, and Rel, resting nearby in a hidden storage alcove, sensed the danger immediately. Before Daniel could even react, Rel burst from its hiding place, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, and threw itself between Daniel and the spreading flames. Using its wings and sheer strength, Rel knocked aside the pressurized containers, sending them skidding safely away from the fire before workers could even process what was happening. It absorbed a burst of heat and sparks that would have seriously injured Daniel, shielding him with its own body without hesitation. The fire was brought under control minutes later, but the damage to secrecy was already done. Dozens of workers, along with several Coalition officers stationed nearby, had witnessed a Scarrow protecting a human during the emergency. Panic spread through the cargo bay almost as fast as the fire had. Word reached Counselor Oves within minutes. He arrived at the cargo bay with a full escort of armed officers, his expression cold and unreadable as he studied Rel, still standing protectively near Daniel, its scales scorched but its posture unwavering. "So," Oves said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "The missing cargo has been found." "It saved lives," Daniel said quickly, stepping forward despite every instinct telling him to stay silent. "It saved me. It's not what you think it is." Oves's gaze did not soften. "It is exactly what the records describe. A living weapon, engineered for destruction. What you witnessed was instinct, not compassion. I understand this may be difficult to accept, but sentiment cannot override galactic law." He gave a sharp gesture, and the officers behind him raised their weapons, aiming at Rel. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped directly between the weapons and the creature that had just risked everything to protect him. "You'll have to go through me," Daniel said, his voice shaking but steady enough to be heard clearly across the cargo bay. "Step aside," Oves warned. "This creature is a danger to every living being in this sector, regardless of what it has done for you personally." "It just saved dozens of people," Daniel shot back. "Doesn't that count for something?" Before Oves could respond, another voice cut through the tense silence. Captain Una Bosch pushed through the gathered crowd, her uniform slightly singed from helping fight the fire moments earlier. She had witnessed the entire event, from the fire's outbreak to Rel's protective actions, and what she had seen did not match the monster Oves described. "Stand down," Una said firmly, addressing the Coalition officers directly. "This is my station, and until I see evidence that this creature poses an active threat, no weapons are being fired in my cargo bay." Oves turned to her, clearly displeased. "Captain, this matter falls under Coalition jurisdiction. The Unity Accord is clear on the handling of Scarrow specimens." "Your accord was written after a war that ended generations ago," Una replied, her tone measured but unwavering. "I just watched that creature save my people from an explosion instead of using the chaos to escape or attack. That's not the behavior your treaty describes." The cargo bay fell into a tense standoff, officers still aiming their weapons, though none fired without a clear order. Daniel remained in front of Rel, refusing to move, his hands trembling but his resolve firm. Ren stood nearby as well, having arrived moments earlier, ready to speak on Rel's behalf if given the chance. Oves studied the scene carefully, clearly recalculating his approach now that the station's own commander had openly challenged him. Killing the creature in front of a crowd that had just watched it perform an act of heroism would create problems far beyond a simple enforcement action. "This is not over," Oves finally said, lowering his hand slightly, causing his officers to reluctantly lower their weapons as well. "But I will allow a formal review before further action is taken. You have until tomorrow to present evidence justifying why this creature should not be destroyed under existing law." As Oves and his officers withdrew, Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe, sinking to his knees beside Rel, whose scorched scales were already beginning to heal. Around them, workers who had witnessed everything began whispering among themselves, no longer certain what to believe about the creature that had just risked its life to save theirs. The night before the formal review, nobody in Daniel's small circle slept. His workshop had become a makeshift meeting room, crowded with people who, only days earlier, had no idea a scarrow lived quietly behind stacks of scrap metal. Ren spread old research files across a workbench, cross-referencing outdated coalition records with new observations she had gathered from watching Rel over the past several days. "The old records only ever describe combat behavior," Ren explained, flipping through pages of notes. "Aggression under battlefield conditions, resistance to pain, enhanced strength. There's nothing about emotional intelligence, nothing about restraint, because nobody ever studied a scarrow outside of war." "That's exactly what we show them tomorrow," Una said, arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway. "Oves is basing his entire argument on outdated fear. If we can prove Rel doesn't match that description, we might actually stand a chance." Daniel sat beside Rel, running a steady hand along its healing scales. The creature had barely left his side since the fire, as if sensing how close things had come to falling apart entirely. "It's not going to be easy," Daniel said quietly. Oves seemed pretty set on his decision. "I don't think evidence alone is going to change his mind." "Maybe not on its own," Ren admitted. "But public opinion might help. A lot of people saw what happened in the cargo bay. Some of them are already questioning what they were taught to believe." The following morning, the outpost's main hall filled once again, though this time the atmosphere felt different from Oves's earlier speech. Word of the fire had spread throughout Calder, and curiosity had replaced much of the fear that once surrounded the topic. Counselor Oves stood at the front of the room, flanked by his officers, his expression as composed as ever, though clearly aware of the shifting mood around him. "We are here," Oves began, "to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to grant an exception to standard protocol regarding the scarrow specimen currently residing on this outpost." Daniel stepped forward first, his voice unsteady but growing firmer with each word. He described finding Rel injured in the wreckage, nursing it back to health, and the quiet, gentle nature it had shown from the very beginning. He spoke of the intruders who had broken into his shop, and how Rel had chosen restraint over violence, despite having every opportunity to cause harm. Ren followed, presenting her research findings, carefully comparing old wartime records against her recent observations. She explained that every documented account of scarrow aggression came from controlled battlefield conditions, engineered specifically to trigger destructive behavior, conditions that simply did not exist in Rel's peaceful life on Calder. Una spoke next, recounting the fire in vivid detail, describing how Rel had acted without hesitation to protect both Daniel and dozens of station workers, using its strength to prevent a much larger explosion rather than exploiting the chaos for its own escape. Oves listened to each account without interruption, his expression unreadable, though several coalition officers behind him exchanged uncertain glances as the testimonies continued. "Even accepting everything you've described," Oves finally said, "one instance of protective behavior does not undo generations of proven danger. The Unity Accord exists because we cannot afford to be wrong about creatures capable of this level of destruction." "With respect," Ren countered, "the Accord was written entirely around wartime data. It never accounted for individual behavior outside combat conditions. You're not enforcing proven danger. You're enforcing an assumption that's never actually been tested." Murmurs spread through the crowd, several onlookers nodding in agreement. Oves's composure flickered slightly as he studied the growing support gathering around Daniel's small group. Before he could respond, a commotion broke out near the hall's entrance. Two coalition officers, apparently uncomfortable with the review's uncertain direction, had grown impatient and moved independently toward Daniel's workshop, intending to eliminate Rel directly rather than wait for the formal outcome. Word reached the hall within seconds, and the room erupted into chaos as people rushed toward the exits, fearing violence was about to break out on their own station. Daniel, Yuna, and Rin sprinted from the hall together, racing back toward the workshop, uncertain what they would find upon arrival. They arrived to find several station residents already gathered outside Daniel's shop, forming a hesitant but determined barrier between the coalition officers and the entrance. Word of the fire and of Rel's heroism had clearly spread further than anyone realized, and ordinary people who had never met Daniel personally were now standing their ground on his behalf. "Stand down," Yuna ordered sharply, pushing through the crowd to face the officers directly. "This ends now, before anyone gets hurt." The officers hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed against an entire crowd of station residents rather than a single defenseless creature. Behind them, Counselor Oves arrived moments later, his expression tightening as he took in the scene before him, an outpost united not by fear, but by something far more complicated and far more difficult to simply order away. Counselor Oves stood at the edge of the crowd gathered outside Daniel's workshop, studying the scene before him with an expression Daniel had not seen from him before. It was not anger, and it was not the cold certainty he had carried since arriving on Calder. It looked, for the first time, like genuine hesitation. The station residents had not moved, forming a quiet but unwavering line between the coalition officers and Daniel's front door. They were not soldiers, and most had never even seen Rel up close, yet they stood their ground anyway, moved by stories of a creature that had risked everything to save strangers during the fire. "Counselor," Yuna said, stepping forward to address Oves directly, her voice calm despite the tension surrounding them. "Look around. These aren't people defending a monster. They're people defending someone who proved, without hesitation, that it deserved a chance." Oves said nothing for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the crowd to the workshop door, behind which Rel remained, having stayed hidden at Daniel's earlier insistence to avoid escalating the situation further. Finally, he turned to his officers and raised a hand, signaling them to lower their weapons. "Stand down," he said quietly. "All of you." The officers complied immediately, though confusion flickered across several of their faces. Oves stepped closer to Daniel, studying him carefully, as though searching for something he had not expected to find in a simple outpost scrap trader. "You understand," Oves said, "that everything I have believed about your kind's connection to creatures like this comes from a war that cost billions of lives. It is not easy to set that aside, regardless of what evidence suggests." "I understand that," Daniel replied honestly. "But punishing Rel for a war it never fought doesn't undo that pain. It just creates new pain, for no reason at all." Oves was quiet again, clearly wrestling with decades of inherited belief clashing against everything he had personally witnessed over the past several days. Slowly, he turned toward Ren, who still held her research files clutched against her chest. "Your findings," he said. "I want a full report submitted to the Coalition Council. Detailed observations, behavioral analysis, everything you've documented so far." "You're not going to destroy it?" Ren asked carefully, hardly daring to hope. "I am not authorized to unilaterally rewrite galactic law," Oves said. "But I am authorized to request a formal review of outdated protocol, especially when new evidence directly contradicts its foundation. What I witnessed here, both during the fire and today, is enough to justify that request." Relief spread visibly through the crowd, though Daniel remained cautious, unwilling to fully believe the danger had passed until he heard the words directly. "So what happens now?" he asked. "For now," Oves said, "the creature remains under your care, provided it stays on this outpost and continues to be documented by Dr. Tallis. This is not a pardon. It is a suspension, pending a full council review that I intend to personally support." It was not the certainty Daniel had hoped for, but it was more than he had dared to expect only hours earlier. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, whispers of the outpost's unusual visitor giving way to cautious relief, Daniel finally opened his workshop door, allowing Rel to step outside for the first time in days. The creature blinked in the sunlight, clearly uncertain after everything that had happened, until its eyes found Daniel standing nearby. It moved toward him immediately, nudging him gently, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Daniel allowed himself a real smile. Word of the events on Calder spread quickly through the sector in the following weeks. Other outposts, initially fearful, grew curious rather than hostile, following the story of a Scarrow that had chosen protection over destruction. Wren's research, submitted alongside UNA's official station report, sparked genuine debate within the Coalition Council, something that had not happened regarding the species in generations. Months later, the Council formally amended a small section of the Unity Accord, allowing individual evaluation of Scarrow behavior rather than automatic termination. It was not a perfect solution, and old fears did not disappear overnight, but it was a beginning, something that had not existed before Daniel found a wounded creature hiding in a crashed transport ship. Outpost Calder became known, quietly at first, as the place where a human had adopted the creature everyone else wanted destroyed. Daniel never thought of himself as someone who changed galactic law, and he never sought recognition for what happened. He simply continued his quiet life among the scrap and machinery, except now, wherever he went, a loyal companion followed close behind, finally free to live without fear of what it had once been created to become.